This story comes out of Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There was this man who said that when he was younger, he would go stay at his grandfather's house for a couple days at a time. Well, this one particular time, he goes over to his grandfather's house, and his grandfather was usually this cheerful, happy man who was always just excited to see his grandson. But for some reason, this time when he goes over to his grandfather's, he seems off. He's kind of nervous and very fidgety. And he starts noticing like his grandfather's doing all these strange things, like nailing the windows shut. And he's smudging, the windows and the doors. And, his grandfather tells him, look, if you go outside and play, you come in before the sun goes down. Don't stay out there after sundown. You come in the house. Which is weird because his grandfather never really cared about any of that. And one night, right, he overhears his grandfather talking to this other man that he has been seeing these star people in the sky and that he was worried they might come to his house. So the young boy, at this time doesn't really know who these star people are or know anything about too much about what's going on. So one night he goes to bed and this boy wakes up in the middle of the night and he said he sees three shadow looking people standing in front of his doorway. And he said, they were so tall they actually had to duck because their heads, right, were like almost hitting the ceiling. And he said these shadow beings, they just walked up to his bed and they stood around him. They put their hands out and he began to hover in the bed. And they started to move him out of his bedroom down the hallway. And he said, he could see everything in real time, like everything that was happening. He hears his grandfather start coughing. And these shadow beings, they hear his grandfather as well coughing. They drop him. And they just took off, really fast towards the door and walk right through the doorway. And his grandfather comes out of the room, what's going on? Why are you out of bed? And he says, grandfather, and he tells him what had happened. And he said that his grandfather gave him like this talisman and said, when you go to bed, sleep with this, keep this by your side, do not lose this. And he said his grandfather didn't say anything about what had happened, but he could tell that his grandfather was even more bothered and that he knew like that he was telling the truth. All across America, I've been hearing these reports for years of these giant spiders that are sometimes the size of dogs. Now, a lot of the reports come from the Appalachia, the Pacific Northwest, and the South. The first sighting actually goes back to 1948 when a family in Leesville, Louisiana, happened to be walking to church one Sunday when they see this very large spider walk across the road into the woods. And they described it as being as large as a washtub. Now, in 2005, there were all of these reports coming from Fort Polk in Louisiana that these soldiers were encountering these spiders that were sometimes larger than a hubcap. And the first story that I actually heard was this soldier who apparently his unit was on some sort of training exercise and they were testing out night vision goggles when they spot this very large spider. They said it looked sort of like a tarantula, and this thing reared up at them. The next report comes in 2009 when you have another soldier who said during another training exercise, they were camping. And in the middle of the night, he sees at the foot of his tent what looks like a man with a very long beard. Except as he looks closer, he realizes this is the foot of some sort of large looking creature. And this thing just backs out and takes off into the woods. Now, the latest encounter with these giant spiders comes from the Appalachia. There was this woman who said in 2022 she was looking for a place to start an art studio. She found this home right in a very secluded wooded area and she purchases it. Well, she said as she moved in and she started to fix this place up, she noticed that it was just completely quiet outside. There was never any insects, any squirrels, any birds, any deer. it was just void of wildlife. The other thing she notices are these very large holes in the ground, the size of basketballs. Well, she said one night she's laying in bed and she hears what sounds like something scurrying in the attic. And whatever this was very large. And she said it just was moving back and forth, back and forth. And then it eventually turned into a scratching sound in her bedroom. Well, for months, this went on like every night. And then she said one night she was walking through the hallway and she discovered something hanging out of the vent, which she described as this large pipe cleaner. She touched it and this thing receded back into the attic. And she said, all this weird stuff would happen where she thought, it could be an animal or maybe it's like, my house is haunted. But then one day her dog goes missing and she searches and searches and she can't find this dog until one day she's walking through the woods and she discovers all of this spider webbing. And she said, it must have been up to like 12, 13 foot high. And within that webbing, she finds her dog. And it all clicked to her. Wait a second. She was like, that sound that I've been hearing in the attic, I think that was like a very large spider. And it was trying to claw and dig into the ceiling to get to me at night. Have you ever seen a ghost peeking around the corner? Now, these peeking ghosts, or peekers as they're often called, are a type of shadow being. Now, people speculate that these may be the spirit of a person who in life was a very violent or evil person. And when they passed, their spirit that remains has no form. And often what it is trying to do by peeking from behind the door, or sometimes even appearing as a person that is just a pile of clothes, is to try and get your attention and to get you to notice it. And by doing so, right, you are giving power to it to come into your life. Now, there was one such story. There was this teenager who lived with his mother. And one night he's sitting in his room and he's watching television. When out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a person peeking from behind the hallway door. So he looks at the TV and he looks back at the door and it's gone. And then once again, out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a person peeking into his bedroom. Another time he's in his kitchen, and as he walks past the hallway, he thinks out of one of the bedrooms he sees a head peeking out at him. But when he looks closely again, there's no one there. And he starts having these experiences around the house, and he thinks that maybe it's only him that sees them. Until one night, he's sitting in his bedroom, and he looks over, and he sees something peek from outside of the doorway. And all of a sudden, his mom comes to the door and is like, "Is everything okay?" And he says, "Yeah, everything's all right, I think." But when he looks at his mom, he sees this thing peek out from behind the doorway real quick. And all of a sudden, he notices his mom just gets this horrified look on her face. And he goes, "What's wrong, Mom? What's wrong?" And she wouldn't tell him. Finally, after a couple days, he gets his mom to tell him why she was horrified that night. And his mom says, "This really weird thing happened when I was talking to you and you were sitting in your bed. I looked over at your closet, and for a second, I seen something peek out from behind the closet door." So one night, he goes to bed, and he wakes up in the middle of the night, and he looks at the post of his bed, right, the front of his bed, and he sees a face peeking up at him. But this time, he actually notices what the face looks like, and he sees this is a woman with long black hair, no eyebrows, solid black eyes, and no mouth or nose. And after he notices this woman, he said he just starts seeing her in his dreams. He started seeing her everywhere he went. And this spirit was almost like tormenting him. His mother, who was very religious, ends up calling in the neighborhood priest. And he comes in and actually does a exorcism on the boy. And after that, he no longer seen this thing anymore. But he realized if he did see it again, not to look at it. The tall hat man is this entity that people often say that they see at night in the room, and they say he often resembles Abraham Lincoln. And I have heard hundreds of reports and cases of people seeing this person that they describe looking like Abraham Lincoln with a large top hat. Now, my uncle, when he was a young boy, he said he was in his room one night, and he said he woke up to like a breeze blowing in to his room, which he thought was weird because he always like kept his window closed. When he looks over at his window, he said like the curtains were kind of blowing. He looked back the other way, and then when he looked back at the window again, he said there was a tall man standing next to the window. And he said he looked just like Abraham Lincoln, except this man was actually standing through his desk. And he said this man just stared at him. and he got this big grin on his face. My uncle was like so terrified he threw the covers over his head, and then he woke up the next day, he was gone. And still to this day, he does not know who that was that he saw. This next story comes out of Virginia. There was this woman. She said that she had went to her grandmother's house when she was younger to stay for a couple weeks. And she said when she would go to her grandma's, she didn't have an extra bedroom, so she would have to sleep out on the couch. So that night, she said, she got ready to go to bed. And like she, went and laid down on the couch. And she said all of a sudden she was awoken to the sound of her grandma talking in her sleep from her bedroom. And she said she goes to her bedroom and she hears her grandma saying, "He's coming. He's coming. No, 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 he's coming." And she is like, "Grandma, you okay? Grandma, you okay?" Her grandma, was just sleeping. So she's like, she must be having a bad dream or whatever. She goes back to her couch. She lays down. And she said, she finally fell asleep. Well, she has this dream. And she says in this dream, she is outside of the house, which happens to be near the woods. And she starts walking through the woods. And she says as she's walking through the woods, she keeps hearing someone chanting, "He's coming, he's coming." And she said it just kept getting louder and louder. And she said all of a sudden she found herself back at her grandma's house. She goes up to the back door and she said she walked inside to the living room. And she said she could see a man standing next to her on the couch, dressed like Abraham Lincoln with this big tall top hat. And she said he was just staring at her. She woke up immediately after this, and she said she looked around the room. She didn't see anything. She said the next day, in the morning, her grandma tells her, "I had the craziest dream."